Every time I set up a new computer, one of the first things I do is download Steam and install FTL faster than light. I've played it on my gaming PC, on my iPad, even inside my web browser. There's just something about this roguelike that keeps me coming back for more. And if you're watching this video, you probably feel the same way. But FTL came out in 2012. There are now thousands of roguelikes on Steam alone, including a decent number of FTL likes. Why are none of these able to scratch the same itch? Well, the answer lies in the way FTL was developed. It took J. Ma and Matthew Davis just 18 months to create one of the best roguelikes ever made. And the key to FTL's timeless appeal lies in their unique approach to game design. So, Matt and Jay met while working at 2K Games Shanghai, a Chinese support studio for games like BioShock 2 and the Civilization series. They bonded over board games they played during their free time. But Matt and Jay weren't happy about the type of games they were making at 2K. The two started designing their own game prototypes in their spare time and discovered a level of work satisfaction that they didn't feel during their day jobs. The duo decided to quit 2K, giving up their steady wages and health insurance to chase their dream of making their own game. Matt and Jay agreed to spend the next 12 months prototyping. If things didn't work out, they would go their separate ways and find new jobs in the game industry. Fortunately, it didn't come to that. The very first prototype they made would be the first version of FTL faster than light. But the process from prototype to finished product was unorthodox, to say the least. Let me explain. One of the first things a game developer learns is the importance of game design documents. They outline every major aspect of your game, from high-level ideas such as the game's overall concept, art style and story, to the minutiae, such as the user interface and controls. As an example, let's take a look at BioShock's game design document, written in 2002. While not all features made the final cut, this 20-page document hits on all the major elements of BioShock. It describes its roots in System Shock 2, its horror atmosphere, the plasmids, the plane crash at the start, and so on. A game design document serves a valuable purpose. It's essentially a blueprint, a clear plan that keeps developers focused on their goals and guides them as they build their game. Game design documents come in all shapes and sizes, and there's no right or wrong way to make one. Grim Fandango's design document has more in common with a movie script. Not only does it describe characters and story events in detail, it also walks you through every single puzzle in the entire game. Even small indie teams tend to work this way. This document for Monaco, What's Yours Is Mine, was written 10 years before its release. It's brief, but details pretty much every mechanic of the final game. Now, Jay and Matt handled things quite a bit differently while developing FTL. When they started prototyping, they stumbled on the concept of the player being the captain of a spaceship almost instantly. But what they hadn't figured out is pretty much everything else. You see, Jay and Matt never made a proper game design document for FTL. All they had at the start of development was one page that didn't really describe a video game at all. It was more of a vibe, describing what playing FTL would feel like. The core pitch of FTL was that most sci-fi games were too actiony, while sci-fi TV shows such as Star Trek and Firefly revolved around the commanders, sci-fi games limited the player to piloting a spaceship. Jay and Matt wanted to make a game true to the spirit of those TV shows, putting the player in the shoes of the commander. All we cared about was making the player feel like they were Captain Picard yelling at engineers to get the shields back online. The original pitch details that specific systems of your ship, such as the engine and shields, could break down. The player would manage the crew members, directing them to fix those modules. The tension in FTL would come from small problems that the player would have to solve before they snowball. Matt described it as follows.
We're out of food and half the ship is on fire and there's these aliens in the docks, so we need to vent the rooms and kill some people, but we save the day and meet the scorpions.
As the captain, the player would also be able to meet and interact with other races through some kind of text-based events. These events would further give you the feeling of being Captain Picard in an episode of Star Trek. Now, at first glance, this all seems to describe the final game pretty well. That's nothing less than a miracle, because it's very unusual for a video game to be developed on the basis of, well, vibes. Even after writing everything down, Jay and Matt didn't have a clue on how to turn that into a proper game. They considered all kinds of genres. A SimCity-like management game with thousands of crew members, an open-ended 4X strategy game where you could build up an entire fleet, and even a diner dash in space, where the player has to solve predefined scenarios and receives a score at the end. So how is it possible then that they turned FTL into one of the best roguelikes ever made? Well, the absence of a proper game design document ended up being one of the game's biggest strengths. You see, Jay and Matt deliberately chose not to create a game design document. The reason? FTL was not meant to be a commercial product. The duo initially planned to work on the prototype for a few months, with the intention of showing it off during interviews and help them land better jobs in the industry. Because they didn't have a design template to follow, Jay and Matt decided to immediately start prototyping and see where that would lead them. This unusual development method would not only result in the FTL we know today, but also to their next game, Into the Breach. To realize their dream of a Captain Picard simulator, their game obviously needed to feature a spaceship. So, for their very first playable prototype, they decided to build a top-down cross-section of a small ship, simply because that was the easiest and fastest way to start. They made the ship's layout grid-based, again because that was the easiest and fastest implementation. FTL's original concept also required a crew to manage, and individual systems with power management. So, in the prototype, the player had to direct the crew of a spaceship flying through an asteroid field, having them repair damage, put out fires, and securing the oxygen supply. After about a month of work, Jay and Matt had built their very first version of their Captain Picard simulator. And it worked surprisingly well. The crew management and ship simulation was compelling. The only problem was with the game itself. The asteroid field went on forever, so the player didn't have a goal to work towards. So Jay and Matt followed the fun. They kept the ship simulation and crew management, but instead of battling an asteroid field, the player would fight actual ships. This ship combat originally took place on a 2D plane. The player would zoom out to steer the ship and zoom in to manage their crew. But this caused new problems. It wasn't very tactical, and the player would quickly lose sight of what was happening inside their ship. You could zoom out, zoom back in 30 seconds later and find half your crew dead and your ship on fire. The only upside was that you could zoom in on the enemy ships and see their crew burn as well. At this point, Jay and Matt were struggling. Matt even began to doubt if their prototype was any good at all. But then he stumbled on a breakthrough that would turn FTL into the game we know and love today. The solution came from a very unexpected place. Jay and Matt couldn't just look at similar games because they were creating something that hadn't really been done before. So they had to look towards other, less obvious sources of inspiration. And it was one of the most successful video games in history that gave Matt the breakthrough he was looking for. You see, while Tetris began as a purely single-player game, later versions introduced multiplayer. In some of these modes, players can attack each other. Clearing lines will send garbage to your opponent, bringing them closer to the game over screen. The two players can also see each other's play field. This was as much a design choice as a decision based on necessity. Tetris multiplayer was introduced before the age of online multiplayer, so players would be battling it out on the same TV. Matt figured that this split-screen setup could also work for his game. After all, the gameplay loop of FTL and Tetris were surprisingly similar. Each player, or in FTL's case, the player and the AI, are managing their own board, while trying to attack the other to destabilize theirs. The player who holds out the longest wins. Additionally, Jay and Matt had figured out that a lot of the fun in FTL was being able to see how your attacks impact the other ship. So once again, Jay and Matt followed the fun. The duo decided to scrap the zoomed out combat entirely, keeping the focus on the interior of your ship at all times. Now, this breakthrough also came with some compromises. Jay and Matt had originally wanted positioning to play a role in the combat, and wanted the player to take on multiple opponents at once, both of which would be impossible with this setup. But the developers realized that the positives of this combat system outweighed the negatives. By following one vague core goal, instead of a detailed game design document, Jay and Matt were able to go straight into the prototyping phase, build on the elements that were fun, and cut everything that wasn't. While this came with some compromises, this method let them stumble on a game concept that hadn't been done before. Jay and Matt knew that thanks to this change, their prototype had potential. All they had to do now was turn it into an actual game. That was less straightforward than it sounds. FTL is known as one of the games that popularized the modern roguelike genre. But Jay and Matt didn't start developing FTL with the intention of turning it into a roguelike. Rather, they followed the fun to a roguelike. And it all started with one thing: the difficulty. Like I've mentioned before, Jay and Matt began the development of FTL with a blank slate. Other than it being a Captain Picard simulator, nothing was set in stone. Except for one more thing: their game needed to be crushingly difficult. Jay and Matt figured that they would never release their game for the general public anyway. So that meant FTL would be designed completely to their tastes. And they loved difficult games.
We had no desire to make people happy. We were making a horribly masochistic experience that we expected no one would want to play. We just literally doing it for ourselves.
In an AMA on Reddit, Matt even mentioned that he had only managed to beat FTL for the first time around a month before release. Still, when launch came around, Jay and Matt feared that they had made the game too difficult. They had balanced the game mostly based on their own experience and that of its beta testers, many of whom had played the game for hundreds of hours. Because of this, the duo decided to add an easy difficulty option in the final weeks of development. Playing on easy gives you more scrap, lowers the health of enemies, and makes the AI less likely to target critical systems of your ship. Now, to make the game seem more accessible, they could have decided to make easy the new normal and rename the normal difficulty to hard. But Jay and Matt stuck to their guns, as they had designed FTL around the normal difficulty setting. In fact, for the true FTL masochists, they even added a separate hard difficulty with the Advanced Edition expansion. While Jay and Matt made significant concessions with the easy mode, permadeath was non-negotiable. To keep things in line with the Captain Picard fantasy, they wanted every decision the player made to matter. That meant no save scumming. The earliest versions of FTL didn't even feature an exit save. This was added later due to popular requests, but Jay and Matt never added a way to reload a save to fix a mistake you made. The decision to add permadeath did not entirely come out of the blue though. You see, Jay and Matt each have very different tastes in games. Matt once said, "Jay and I approach game design and games in a very similar way, but we have shockingly different tastes in the games we play and enjoy the most." But there was one game they were both equally entranced by when it released. It was, to no one's surprise, incredibly difficult and provided the foundation for FTL's roguelike design, the original Spelunky. So, Spelunky is one of the most influential games of all time. You've probably heard of Spelunky HD, which released in the same year as FTL, but its roots go even further back. Developer Derek Yu released the original Spelunky as freeware in 2008. While the game did not yet gain mainstream popularity, the release spread like wildfire in the game developer community. Why? Well, handcrafted levels were seen as a prerequisite for a good 2D platformer. But Spelunky blew devs away in 2008, because it featured procedurally generated levels. Derek Yu showed the world it was possible to successfully combine the roguelike framework with other genres. It's the reason why we now have roguelike shoot-em-ups, roguelike deck builders, roguelike rhythm games. And it's the reason why we have FTL. Jay says that Spelunky was an experience we drew from frequently. Other than being an excellent game, I feel Derek Yu really figured out the formula for distilling the spirit of roguelikes into another genre. While Spelunky is a side-scrolling platformer and FTL a top-down tactics game, they share many similarities. Some are fairly obvious, such as the procedural generation, permadeath, and emphasis on resource management. But there is one more major mechanic that Spelunky and FTL share, and it's a fairly controversial one. When you first start playing Spelunky, you'll probably take your time. You're still trying to figure out the controls, you don't know how the enemies behave, and there's loads of treasure hidden all throughout each level. But after around 2 minutes, the game's music pitches down, and you see a foreboding line of text show up on your screen. Now, you might be tempted to stick around just a bit longer, because there's more gold to collect, right? Well, if you ignore Spelunky's warning, 30 seconds later, you'll hear a sound effect that can only mean one thing. The ghost has arrived. The ghost is Spelunky's ultimate enemy. It pursues you mercilessly, can be damaged, and kills you in one hit, no matter how much health you have. This might seem like an unfun thing to add to a game, but the ghost serves a very distinct purpose. In fact, this mechanic has existed since the early days of the roguelike genre. Many of these early roguelikes have some kind of limited resource that the player needs to consume in order to prevent death. It's most commonly known as a hunger clock or a food clock, because in many old roguelikes, this limited resource was literally food. In Spelunky, that limited resource is time. The ghost puts the player on the clock, in order to prevent them from being able to grind endlessly and from playing too defensively. It quite literally pushes the player forward, as the only way to escape the ghost is to exit the level and move on to the next. In theory, Derek Yu could have implemented a literal timer to fulfill the same purpose, but the ghost feels more immersive, an extra obstacle to overcome. Just like in Spelunky, FTL's limited resource is time. However, as you don't travel through the game's sectors in real time, you're given a certain number of turns instead. To fit the sci-fi theme of FTL, its hunger clock is disguised as the rebel fleet. Just like the ghost, the fleet is relentlessly chasing you. And if they manage to catch up, you're in big trouble. Rebel ships deal heavy damage, and the reward for destroying one is basically worthless. So avoiding them entirely is pretty much always your best bet. The fleet forces the player to plan out a route in advance, so they can visit as many nodes as possible while still being able to reach a sector's exit in time. But as I said, this system was somewhat controversial. Many players felt it was too punishing. They didn't like being rushed and wanted to explore on their own terms. So, not long after FTL's release, someone created a mod that disables the fleet entirely, letting you visit every node in every system. According to Matt, this mod made many players realize why the fleet was so essential.
It was a light bulb moment of, now I understand what the fleet mechanic does. Before I took it out, I thought it was an annoyance, but now that I took it out, I can see that the structure of the game relies on it. Right. And it was really fun seeing people discover that design by poking in our game.
Thanks to the mod, players discovered that FTL works precisely because of its roguelike mechanics. Just like its crushing difficulty and its randomization, FTL's hunger clock is an essential element of its design. It might surprise you, but everything we talked about so far took place in a span of just 6 months. By following the fun, Jay and Matt had nailed FTL's core gameplay loop shockingly quickly. It made them realize that they had stumbled onto something special. FTL wasn't just a side project to help them find a job anymore. The duo decided to go all in, to turn their game into a commercial product. They also realized that game design can only carry a game so far. Jay and Matt wanted to create a spaceship captain simulator. To truly put the player in the shoes of Captain Picard, FTL's presentation would be just as important as its underlying mechanics. This is something Jay and Matt were struggling with. They had already brought Ben Prunty on board to create FTL sounds and music, but they couldn't afford to pay him, so he was pretty much working on FTL for free, which meant his output was very limited. The Star Trek-like events were another issue.
We thought mistakenly that it's just text. You just write a few more and then you have a lot, and then there's a lot of variety in the game. How hard can that be?
Turns out surprisingly hard. Jay, who handled the game's writing, eventually realized that FTL would need an entire novel's worth of text to keep the player from running into the same events over and over. That would require too much time for someone who also functioned as FTL's artist and co-designer. The only option would be to bring a dedicated writer on board. The problem was that Jay and Matt didn't have the money to hire additional staff. They didn't even have money to sustain themselves. At this point, it had been months since their last paycheck from 2K China, and their savings were starting to run dry. Jay and Matt estimated that $10,000 would be enough to carry FTL across the finish line. So, in February of 2012, the duo turned to Kickstarter to scrape together the funds they needed. They got a bit more than they bargained for. Now, back in 2012, Kickstarter wasn't exactly the household name it is today. Jay and Matt mainly hoped to share their campaign with friends and family that could give them the extra push they needed to finish their dream game. But FTL got worldwide attention, thanks to legendary developer Tim Schafer. If you're unaware, Schafer is best known for his work on point-and-click classics, such as the Monkey Island series and Grim Fandango. By the way, he wrote that game's entire game design document we mentioned before. His studio, Double Fine, had just launched a Kickstarter to fund their point-and-click adventure game Broken Age. That was huge news, as point-and-clicks were pretty much an extinct genre at the time.
But these days it seems like adventure games are almost a bit of a lost art form.
Many older gamers were nostalgic for the kind of games they had played as kids in the 90s, so the Double Fine Kickstarter brought a giant amount of attention to the site. And FTL immediately stood out for its unique concept of a roguelike Captain Picard simulator. The result? Jay and Matt's Kickstarter goal was reached in just a few hours. They were completely blindsided by the Kickstarter's success. People were complaining as Jay and Matt had set their highest backer tier at $40. They were forced to invent higher tiers on the fly. FTL's Kickstarter campaign finished with over $200,000 in pledges, over 20 times more than they had asked for. Jay and Matt, now the co-owners of Subset Games, didn't need this much money to finish their game, but it did allow them to bring on talented people that helped bring FTL's atmosphere to the next level. Thanks to the Kickstarter money, Jay and Matt were able to pay Ben Prunty to create a full soundtrack for the game. Matt himself said that
one of the things I'm most proud about coming out of the game is that we helped make this awesome thing of music come out.
The other big addition to the project was Tom Joubert, who would later write the stories for Subnautica and the Talos Principle. Tom had discovered FTL on his own and loved it so much that he approached Subset Games himself to see if they needed a writer. Hiring Tom would relieve Jay from the workload of writing events and let her focus on FTL's art and design instead. Next to multiplying the number of events, Tom also fleshed out the backgrounds of FTL's universe and the alien races that inhabit it, something that the team had also struggled with. Still, despite now having a dedicated writer on the team, Jay and Matt insisted on keeping the writing short and not too detailed, both because they didn't want to slow down the game with long story sections and because they were trying to make the player feel like they're Captain Picard in an episode of Star Trek. As Matt said, that atmosphere is so ingrained in science fiction culture that there's not a lot you need to do to trigger fans to live in it. As long as you're hitting some of the core bases, they're going to fill in the rest themselves because they're experiencing something they already know about. Thanks to the Kickstarter, Jay and Matt were able to realize FTL's excellent sound and narrative design. That was the final piece of the puzzle, turning the game into the Captain Picard fantasy they had wanted to bring to life. FTL ended up not only being a commercial success, it was also a critical hit when it launched, just 7 months after the Kickstarter. Jay and Matt won multiple awards, including the Excellence in Design Award at the Independent Games Festival in 2013. It also got rave reviews, with PC Gamer naming it its short-form Game of the Year in 2012. And even over 12 years later, FTL still enjoys an overwhelmingly positive rating on Steam. That's not to say that FTL is a perfect game. Despite its widespread acclaim, the game has also received its fair share of criticism. Most of this criticism can be divided into two camps. The first big complaint about FTL is related to the RNG. In FTL, pretty much everything is determined by random chance. The maps, events, shops, enemies, rewards, attacks, dodges, everything. Now, when I say random chance, I mean random chance. Many games that seem like they're based on random chance actually stack the odds in the player's favor. If you play XCOM 2 on the veteran difficulty, your chances to hit a shot are 10% higher than the percentage the game shows you. FTL doesn't do this. Jay and Matt have confirmed that there are no hidden percentages or mechanics in FTL to make the game's rules as transparent as possible. So when the game says you have a 15% chance to dodge an attack, you have a 15% chance to dodge an attack. This means that you can encounter runs where you get very lucky, but it also means that your run can fall apart with a couple bad rolls of the dice. Losing like this can quickly feel unfair. The second major complaint is about the game's difficulty. If you've played FTL and you've beaten the final boss, then congrats! You're part of the happy few. On Steam, 25% of players managed to beat the final boss on easy, and less than 10% have beaten the game on normal. Now, Jay and Matt made FTL with the intention of it being extremely hard. It's what they enjoyed and what they wanted to play. But there is one part of FTL that, in retrospect, even Jay and Matt consider a bit much. A fight so disliked, they still get hate mail about it to this day. You guessed it, I'm talking about the Flagship. The Flagship is FTL's final showdown. After traversing 8 different sectors, you face off against the biggest and baddest ship in the Rebel fleet. Win and you'll secure victory for the Federation. Lose and your run ends right before the finish line. The Flagship is by far the hardest ship you'll face in FTL. It has everything: cloaking, hacking, 4 layers of shields, 4 different weapons and 11 crew members. And that's just the first phase. To see the credits roll, you need to beat this ship 3 times in a row. Knowing this, it makes sense that the majority of FTL players have never even seen the victory screen. The Flagship does a great job as the brutal climax of the tough-as-nails Captain Picard simulator Jay and Matt wanted to make. Maybe it even does its job a little too well. Matt says that we still get emails today with people complaining about how impossibly difficult the final encounter in FTL is. But the Flagship is not only overpowered, it also outright cheats. You see, regular ships are bound to the same rules as the player. If you manage to kill all enemy crew members, you automatically win the fight, as the ship will be unable to attack you. That's also the case for the player. If you lose all your crew members, either through combat or a random event, you lose the run. But the Flagship does not play by these rules. If you manage to kill all 11 crew members, an AI system will simply take over control of the ship and continue the fight. Another example is how the systems work. In regular combat, you target specific systems of the enemy ship to disable them. If you want to shut down drones, for example, you need to target its drone system. But even if you completely disable the Flagship's drone system in Phase 2, its power surge ability still lets it launch a devastating drone attack at you. The Flagship also breaks the randomization rule of FTL. While regular enemies predictably scale in difficulty as you progress in the run, their systems and weaponry are randomly generated. Your ship's equipment will also depend on chance, as the weapons, systems, and augmentations you encounter are decided by RNG. Your arsenal will depend on how lucky you get, but the Flagship will always have the same overpowered weapons and abilities. The Flagship's design clashes with the rest of FTL. It's an enormous difficulty spike and breaks the rules of the game. Even the developers themselves feel that the difficulty spike of FTL's final boss is too extreme. As Matt puts it, FTL had an excessively difficult boss that broke a lot of the core rules of the game. We've come a long way since the release of FTL in 2012. It's still a great game, easy to learn but hard to master. Every run is unique, it has an incredible soundtrack and engaging lore that remains mysterious enough to let you fill in the blanks. But it's also not perfect. FTL's high difficulty is not for everyone. Its reliance on randomness can quickly become frustrating, and its final boss outright cheats by breaking the game's core rules. And yet, over 12 years later, thousands of people are still playing FTL every day. Why? Well, it's because of why the game was made in the first place. Jay and Matt didn't start developing FTL with the intention of making one of the most beloved roguelikes of all time. In an interview, Jay says that
because I think the only reason why FTL was good was because we were making it from a state of no one's ever going to see this, like let's just have fun.
Jay and Matt's idea of fun was a very difficult game that puts the player in the shoes of Captain Picard. They followed the fun throughout FTL's development, keeping the things they enjoyed and scrapping the things they didn't, always keeping their eye on that one goal. It's how they stumbled on the roguelike format, which ended up being the perfect framework for their game. Because nothing fits the job description of a spaceship captain better than figuring out how to deal with the unexpected situations the universe throws at you. Making tough choices that can mean the difference between victory and defeat, that's what being Captain Picard is all about. Yes, the game isn't perfect. It's very difficult, perhaps overly so. And its punishing RNG means that sometimes things just go wrong and there's nothing you can do about it. Sometimes you lose your best crew member to giant alien spiders. Sometimes shops will refuse to sell you any kind of weapon. Sometimes the flagship will decide to screw you over and hack your shields. But it's important to not take these unlucky breaks personally, because FTL is more than just a roguelike. There's simply no other game out there that captures the stress, triumph and heartbreak of being a spaceship captain the way FTL does. These frustrating moments are an essential part of the Captain Picard fantasy that Jay and Matt wanted to create. But hey, don't take it from me.
It is possible to commit no mistakes and still lose. That is not a weakness. That is life.
Don't forget to like this video if you want to see more retrospectives on classic indie games. And check out this video for a similar deep dive into Slay the Spire. Thank you very much for watching.